Our gospel lesson today comes from Matthew. We start the 5th chapter. Last week we read about Jesus calling his disciples. And today now we start a series of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And we start with the Beatitudes, verses 1 through 12. Continue to listen now for God's word. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain. And after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice, and your reward is great in heaven. In the same way, they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Today we come to Jesus' vision statement. The Beatitudes lay out what Jesus' ministry will be about. People have repented and responded to Jesus' call, and now he begins to share with them what this new kingdom will look like and who it is for. Matthew puts Jesus on a mountain to proclaim. Remember that Matthew's audience is mostly Jewish. And so, Old Testament. Like Moses, therefore, Jesus speaks to the people from the mountain. Only Jesus gives the people a different set of instructions from God. Instead of a listing of thou shalt nots, commandments that became legal prescriptions for how to live one's life, Jesus gives the people a series of blessed ares. Not at all what his Jewish audience. Jesus didn't say, "Blessed are you, children of Abraham." Jesus didn't say, "Blessed are you who are well off because you've been faithful to sacrificing and observing the Sabbath." What they hear instead is that their Messiah is not just blessing them. Blessed are the poor and the meek, has a much wider population. What's more, Jesus is speaking a whole new language. His vision is not from the Torah or the Talmud. The first thing Jesus wants people to know is that God is not primarily a God of judgment and legalism and exclusivity. The commandments are twisted in interpretation. And exacting, that it was taking precedence over people. And so Jesus came to set it right. And he begins his ministry by proclaiming blessedness. Those who mourn is Jesus. Kind Jesus. Jesus isn't called and others in Jesus' day based on their heritage. For those with society and popular, those who seem to have it all. They thought they had a sure and certain path to heaven. Jesus knew that they could count on justice and kindness coming their way. The poor, the hungry, the sorrowing tend to be threatening to people who are comfortable with their place in society. Those who have little to offer tend to be disregarded and overlooked by those who seem to be self-sufficient. Jesus did not want them to be forgotten. And so Jesus lifted them up. He put their vulnerability in front of us to remind us that at some time in our life, we are all need allows us to embrace all of life, even the vulnerable and the broken places. If we can embrace our own brokenness, then we can embrace those among us who are broken. Jesus is teaching and reminding the people in his day and all of us that God's self is revealed most clearly at our places of deepest need. When we really need God, we are aware of God's presence so much more. I think it was no accident that I was thinking about this passage during a week when we buried Teresa Robinson and when Ann O'Connell had critical surgery. When we are sick, when we are looking at death or the possibility of death, whenever we feel close to the edge of life, that's when we most assuredly lean into God. feel God's blessing. Brian Stevenson, Harvard-educated lawyer and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, has been working to tell the whole story of blacks in America. He's the main character in a new movie with the same name as his book. It's called Just Mercy, and Steve Justice put me onto it. It's the story, Just Mercy, is the story of how Stevenson worked to get an innocent man off of death row. More recently, he has spearheaded the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, which explores the history of racial inequality in hopes of promoting reconciliation. Pulling together this history was to have people go to lynching sites and collect soil from them and put it in a jar. The jar is then labeled with the victim's name and the date of the lynching. Jar. Stevenson shares the story of a middle-aged black woman who was nervous about going to one of these lynching sites by herself. The site was in a pretty remote area, but she decided to do it. She went to the place where the lynching happened. She was about to start digging for the soil when a truck drove by. And there was a white man in the truck who slowed down and stared at her. And then the truck stopped. And a big white man got out and started walking toward her. She became more nervous. The white man walked up to her and said, "What are you doing?" She said something got hold of her. And she turned to the man and said, "I'm digging soil because this is where a black man was lynched in 1931, and I'm going to honor his life." She was so scared that she started digging really fast. And then the man stood there and said, "Does that paper you have talk about the lynching?" And she said, "Yes, it does." And then he said, "Can I read it?" And she gave the man the paper, and he stood there reading while she was digging. And then he put the paper down and asked, "Would it be okay if I helped you?" And then he got on his knees. She offered him the trowel, but he started digging with his hands. He put the soil in her jar. His hands were covered in black soil, and it moved her. And she said the next thing she knew, tears were running down her face. And he stopped and said, "I'm sorry for upsetting you. I'm afraid my grandparents might have been part of that lynching." And she said, No, you're not upsetting me. You're blessing me." And they kept putting the soil in the jar. The The Beatitudes call us to remember that God comes not just to the faithful and the accomplished and the proud. God comes where we least expect God to be, amid the brokenness. Jesus announced from the mountain that his followers needed to be different. He affirmed Micah's prophecy. His kingdom people needed to do justice and love kindness and walk humbly. They needed to bless that which the world refuses to bless. They needed to love what the world calls unlovable. They needed to redeem that which the world does not believe merits saving. Jesus' vision statement gave unconditional blessing in hopes that a people separated could find common ground in their brokenness and their blessedness. Those in the kingdom of heaven would be blessed in order to bless.